So let's begin. We at Chaucer's are honored to host tonight's author, Daniel E. Lieberman, the author of the book Exercise: Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. Daniel Lieberman, who is joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, is Edwin M. Lerner Professor of Biological Sciences and Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. In addition to this book, he is the author of the national bestseller, The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health, and Disease. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. All right. Shall I just get going? So
Sure.
let me share my screen, and
There.
and here we go.
All right.
All right. Well, I'm delighted to talk to you about exercise. Let me just start off by saying that if this is like a typical audience of representative of the United States, that is, about 20% of you would have done about what's generally recognized by pretty much every sort of health organization on the planet as the minimum recommended amount of exercise that people should do a week, which is 150 minutes a week. But the other 80% of us don't really like to exercise. We're ambivalent, we're confused, we're anxious, we're bullied, and don't manage to do 150 minutes of physical activity a week. And so for most folks, who wants to read a book about exercise, right? It's not really a very pleasant topic, right? And if you can go to any bookstore, you can find all kinds of sort of silly books about, that sort of promise you a perfect body with basically no effort. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. My goal today is to try to help all of us be less exercised about the topic of exercise. And before I go any further, there's a whole bunch of folks I'd like to thank, because a book like this doesn't just appear out of nowhere. There's lots of colleagues and friends who helped in various ways, and I won't go through all the names, but just let me assure you that I'm grateful to all of them for the help on this book. So what I want to do for the next 30 minutes is that I'll briefly talk about why I wrote the book and what the sort of the inspiration was, and then I'll talk about what it's about, and give 3 different examples of myths of exercise, which is sort of one of the ways in which I've organized the book. So, it's a cliche, but most cliches are true because they're true, right? And I was, a classic kind of nerdy kid who really was picked last for pretty much most teams. Here's a picture of me in, I think, 6th or 7th grade. And I grew up sort of ashamed of my body, and I once sort of hid in a closet to, escape gym class and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't realize it, but I had fantastic role models, and one of them was my mother, who was who started running in the late 60s in order to liberate the gym at the University of Connecticut. Now, they didn't let women in the gym, and she was so pissed off that she started running, not because she liked running or she was even very good at it, but because she wanted to make sure that the gym was open for women. And running kind of changed her, and she became addicted eventually and ran 5 miles a day for about 5 decades. And she destroyed her knee hiking in New Zealand a few years ago, but she still exercises very rigorously every day. Anyway, so I grew up after that, sort of typical nerd. I would go jogging occasionally and, hiking and whatever, but I was never very particularly athletic. And I became a professor. And in the first part of my career, I focused on heads, right? I was a kind of a head guy. And I got interested in the topic of running, actually, because I started doing some research on how humans stabilize their heads. So most animals are quadrupeds, right? And they can basically flex and extend their necks, but we were like pogo sticks. We jump up and down. And I was curious about how humans stabilize their heads. And we discovered some really interesting mechanisms. And that led to a paper that I co-published with my colleague and friend, Dennis Bramble, in the journal Nature, the Born to Run paper in 2004. That was quite a hit. And then from there, we started studying barefoot running. And before I knew it, I wasn't just studying heads. I was also studying the evolution of human physical activity. And I got interested in this field of evolutionary medicine, which is how we apply evolutionary theory and data to health and disease. And my last book, The Story of the Human Body, is really about the problem of mismatch, right? Which is this idea that many of the diseases, in fact, most of the diseases that we get today, result from our bodies being inadequately or imperfectly adapted to the kinds of environments that we now live in. And that ranges from flat feet and myopia to really serious diseases like heart disease and diabetes and atherosclerosis and Alzheimer's, and the list is very long. So anyways, I was finishing up that book in 2012. I was sort of putting the final touches on it. And I first went to, and I was on sabbatical that year, and I first went to Kona to see the Ironman Championship, where I participated in a medical conference, and then I almost immediately got on a plane and went to Mexico, where I was doing field work with the Tarahumara, who are a Native American people who live in northern Mexico, in the state of Chihuahua. And they're sort of famous for their running, and I hadn't been there before, and I sort of traveled all over the area in a pickup truck, and slept on people's floors, and was measuring people's feet, and how they were running, and talking to various folks. And I had my little sort of list of anthropological questions I was asking everybody, and I was sort of struggling, because whenever I asked everybody about how they trained for running, people really were struggling to understand what I meant by training. But I did get to see some of the famous races, and I've now actually been there many times and seen them, and actually participated in some of these races. And I got to see the famous women's race, which is called the Arouete, where women run. They have a little cloth circle, and they flick it with these sticks, and they run and chase and run and chase and flick, and it's really quite amazing. And the men's race is called the Rara Hippari, where they have a little wooden ball which they flick with their feet, and then they chase it and find it and flick it again and run. And it's really just a very beautiful race. Both of these races are really quite amazing, and often considerable distances. But as I said before, I was asking everybody about their running and their feet, and I was measuring their feet, and there's this one guy who was really quite, I remember, I'll never forget, because he was a kind of an elderly fellow, and I was told he was a great runner, and actually I got to see him in action. Here's some photos of him running. And when I was asking him about how he trains for running, he just didn't get the idea. And I was working with a translator, and she was trying to explain how this gringo who's asking you questions, gets up in the morning and he runs 5 miles, and, to kind of get ready for running. And he looked at me and he said, well, why would anybody run if they didn't have to? And I remember kind of laughing, a little bit of embarrassment, but realizing, yeah, actually it makes sense. The kind of exercise that I do is really very weird. And because the way he trains is just by living his life. He works really hard as a farmer, and that's actually how he gets the fitness in order to run. And in fact, it made me suddenly realize that exercise is a weird behavior, right? So to understand that, it helps to have some definition. So physical activity is really any bodily movement that you produce, right? That by skeletal muscles that expends energy. It's like, it's whatever you do, right? So, mopping the floor, or digging in your garden, or going to work, or whatever, that's all physical activity. But exercise is a special kind of physical activity. It's discretionary, it's voluntary physical activity, which we undertake to sustain or improve health and fitness, right? And it's something that we've medicalized, and we've commercialized, and we've commodified, right? It's a product that we sell and that we prescribe. And to me, the apotheosis of just how weird exercise is the treadmill. And if you read the book, you'll see that I make fun of treadmills pretty much throughout the book, even on the cover and in the preface, because think about just how weird a treadmill is. It's this noisy, horrible, nasty machine that you pay money for, that makes you work really hard to get nowhere. I mean, I don't know anybody who actually enjoys being on a treadmill for its own sake. And if you think, by the way, treadmills are a form of torture, you're actually right. The treadmill was invented by a fellow named William Cubitt, the modern treadmill, that is, in the Victorian era, to punish Victorian prisoners, to make sure that they didn't actually sort of have a good time when they were in prison. So that tradition of torturing people on treadmills is actually really quite old. So treadmills really are sort of an example of how today some of us are exercised about exercise, where people are the word exercise means to be vexed, worried, anxious, and harassed. And there's so many reasons and so many questions that people have about exercise. They want to know whether or not they should be barefoot, or while running on their knees, or how much they should run. And people are exercised about how to get motivated to exercise in the first place, or how much weights or cardio they should do, or and they're also exercised about physical inactivity like sleep and sitting. But the biggest problem is that most of us don't exercise enough. As I said before, less than 20% of Americans get the minimum dose of recommended physical activity from every major health organization in the world, like the WHO and the American Heart Association, the American College of Sports Medicine, you name it. Everybody thinks that we should get at least 150 minutes a week, and also you should try to get two bouts of strength training in it as well a week. But the vast majority of Americans don't do that. In fact, only about 50% of Americans even ever exercise in their leisure time. And I think part of the problem is that we have a very Western post-industrial bias, right? Almost all the data that we have about physical activity and about exercise and what we think comes from studying people like us, right? People who live in places like America or Europe or Australia. And yet we're just a sliver of the world, like about 10% of the world, and about 90% of humanity doesn't live like us and doesn't think like us. And in fact, for most of human evolution, people didn't think like us and look like us. So we have this kind of very strange bias. And so what I wanted to do was write a natural history of physical activity and exercise. And there are really sort of two mantras that guide the book. The first is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, because we weren't engineered, we weren't designed, we evolved. So if you want to know how the human body works and what we do and why we do it, you have to understand that evolutionary history. But we're also kind of complex human creatures, right? And nothing about our behavior makes sense except in the light of anthropology. And so it's a natural history in which I try to combine my own experiences, and there's a lot of anthropology, there's biology, health science, all kind of mixed together, hopefully in a kind of narrative format, to try to make it enjoyable. Because after all, I'm very aware that most people don't really want to read a book about exercise. It's an intrinsically unpleasant topic, right? And so one of the ways in which I've organized the book is to tell the story of exercise, tell the story of physical activity, in a kind of natural history way. So if you want to understand physical activity, we have to first start with physical inactivity. So the beginning of the book is about rest and sitting and sleeping. And then most animals are really good at speed and strength and fighting. So that's what the second part of the book is about. But we're a special species. We're particularly good at endurance. So the third part of the book is about endurance physical activities like walking and running and dancing and carrying, as well as how that relates to aging. And then the final section of the book is about how all that applies to modern health and disease, how we get people to exercise and what's the right kind of dose and how does that affect various kinds of diseases. And each chapter, to make it kind of fun and also to kind of help people be less exercised about exercise, in each chapter, I kind of tackle a different myth, right? And of course, I don't have time to go through all the chapters and all the myths and all the ideas in the book. So I thought I'd give you kind of a brief taste of some of those myths. And I have to start really with the biggest myth of all, which is that we evolved to exercise. So what do I mean by that? So in my opinion, I think we've kind of suffered what I call the myth of the athletic savage, right? We have this idea that people who aren't contaminated by civilization are just kind of amazing athletes. And if we didn't have Gatorade and running shoes and all that kind of stuff, we could just get out of bed and run ultra marathons and lift sort of huge rocks over our heads. And to some extent, that's, there's some truth, of course, to that myth. And our ancestors, and until 600 generations ago, everybody on the planet was a hunter-gatherer. And we know from ethnographic data and from the archaeological record that hunter-gatherers are, they're physically active people. They have to walk all over the place. They carry things, they're digging, they're climbing, they're running, they're dancing. They do a fair amount of physical activity, but it's untrue that they're incredibly physically active. It turns out that data on hunter-gatherers from various populations in different parts of the world, including some from anthropologists from UC Santa Barbara, shown that hunter-gatherers in general are, in terms of moderate to vigorous physical activity, do about 2 to 3 hours a day, more closer to 2 rather than 3. And most of the day, just like us, they rest, they sit. And in fact, I think the basic basic sort of observation that everybody has is that people really, in most parts of the world, are physically active only when it's necessary or rewarding. And I want you to remember that idea, because we'll come back to it. So that means I think we should be really compassionate about people's natural instincts, right? We all know this situation, right? You're in a mall or a subway station or an airport or whatever, and there's a stairway next to an escalator, and there's that little voice in your head, right, which says, at least there's a voice in my head which says, take the escalator, right? And of course, there were no escalators in the Stone Age, but it's an instinct to save energy when you can, right? Because energy is limited, and energy you spend on physical activity, if energy is limited, is energy that you can't spend on reproducing or on taking care of your body. So let's be compassionate. People aren't lazy because they want to take the escalator. They're simply obeying very deep and basic and fundamental instincts. Okay, so with that introduction, let's look at a few other myths. So one of the myths is, as I said before, that I started the book thinking about inactivity, because of course you can't be active all day long. You can't exercise all day long. And when you're inactive, most of the time you're inactive, you're sitting, right? And yet we've been told that sitting is the new smoking, right? We've demonized sitting, right? And there are statistics out there that saying that, if you sit more than 3 hours a day, that's responsible for like 4% of deaths worldwide. And then an hour of sitting is as harmful as the benefit of 20 minutes of exercise, and on and on and on. I can tell you all kinds of sort of scary statistics about sitting. And yet, wherever you go around the planet, you see people sitting. And in fact, my dog spends most of her day sitting, and sitting is very natural and very normal. Cows sit, animals sit. Sitting is a very basic fundamental instinct. So this, for example, is a hunter-gatherer camp in Tanzania. This is actually the photo I took as I first walked into the camp, right? So I arrived there, and what's everybody doing? They're all sitting, right? And in Mexico, where I work, people sitting all the time. And in Africa, I work in Kenya, people are sitting all the time. Wherever you go around the planet, people are sitting all the time. So one question is, how many hours a day do we sit? And there's a lot of really bad information out there. So if you do a Google search, you can get, um, um, pretty much every number on the planet, from 6 hours a day to 15 hours a day. I mean, it's hard to know how to really evaluate it. But it turns out that when you actually look at high quality data, that younger Americans sit around 9 to 10 hours a day. And as we get older, we tend to sit a little bit more. So older Americans tend to sit around 12 to 13 hours a day. And this is data based on putting sensors on people. So it's accurate and reliable data. But there's a lot of variation, right? Of course, people sit more on weekdays than weekends, and it varies by age and by sex and socioeconomic status. It's really very complicated. So what about hunter-gatherers? Well, it turns out they sit pretty much as Americans. They sit about 10 hours a day, according to research done by my friend and colleague Dave Reichland, former postdoc in my lab. So the idea that sitting is this kind of weird, modern, strange behavior is just simply not true. But that said, we also sit differently, and I think really there's a really much more interesting story out there, and that is that when we sit, we tend to sit on chairs with backrests, and we often sit for long and sustained bouts, right? So if you're sitting and listening to this lecture, you're probably sitting, and you'll be sitting pretty much inertly for about an hour, right? So in the average bout is about 40 minutes, but people in societies that don't have chairs, and was almost all the world until recently, and most of the world still today. You don't have a backrest. You sit on the ground, and often, and people don't sit for as long. So their bouts, the length of time that they spend sitting at any one period of time is much shorter, about 15 minutes about. And if you look at the data, that's actually important. So looking at the right side of the screen here first, it turns out that people who sit the same amount of time, but who break up their sitting into terms of 12-minute bouts, so they get up every once in a while, every 12 minutes or so, even if they're sitting the exact same amount of time, their mortality rate is actually about half the amount of people who are sitting for longer than 30 minutes at a time. So it's a really good idea when you're sitting to break up your sitting regularly, because it sort of wakes up your muscles. It's like turning on your car engine, right? It turns on all kinds of metabolic factors going on in your muscles, and it reduces the sugar in your bloodstream and the fatty acids in your bloodstream. It's a really good thing to do to interrupt your sitting. It also turns out that if you look at sitting time and mortality and various kinds of diseases, it's actually work time sitting is actually not that correlated with poor health outcomes. It's actually leisure time sitting, which is much more correlated with poor health outcomes. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you go to work and sit at much of the day at work, but then you're also sitting in your car to get to work, and then you're sitting at home all evening long, and you're basically not exercising at all. That means that you're not getting any physical activity, and of course that's obviously a problem. So all in all, I think we should be less exercised about sitting. It's not abnormal to sit as long as you do get some physical activity. And if you are going to sit, try to sit actively and interrupt your sitting, so you're not sitting for really long periods of time. And I didn't go to the lecture, but it turns out a lot of what we hear about posture and sitting is really complete malarkey. And so if you slouch, don't worry about it. But again, you can read about it in the book. Okay, so a second myth is that we evolved to be super strong. And there's this idea that our caveman ancestors were like these incredible, bulked, ripped, jacked, incredibly strong individuals. And a lot of these ideas, actually, I sort of traced them in the book, come from this guy here, Paul de Chailloux, was a very interesting explorer, not a very nice man actually, who was the first Westerner to observe gorillas, and he came back and he described, how dangerous and large and exciting and gorillas were. It's a very disturbing, his books, actually, greatly quite disturbing, and his depictions of gorillas kind of really influenced people of the time, including the people who, when we first discovered Neanderthals. And it's not entirely coincidental that the first sort of depictions of Neanderthals were, I think, highly influenced by Du Chaillu's descriptions of gorillas. It turns out that that our ancestors and also our cousins, like the chimpanzees, they're stronger than us, chimpanzees, but they're not that much stronger. Chimpanzees are about 30% stronger, but hunter-gatherers, like modern humans who from different parts of the world who still hunt and gather for their food, turns out they're not super strong, right? In fact, they can't even afford to be very strong because muscle is a really expensive tissue. So you want enough to be as strong as you need to be, but an extra muscle actually means that you're spending extra energy to pay for all that muscle. So they're not bulked, they're not ripped, they don't need to be, they're not doing those kinds of physical activities. They don't have gyms either where they can, apply, loads to their joints, at every single angle, etc. They're reasonably strong, but the key thing about them is that they stay strong throughout their life period. So this is data, for example, from the Aceh, compared to, this is actually data from England. These are men on the left and women on the right. And you can see that the Aceh are pretty strong compared to, say, Brits. They're about sort of 75th percentile. But importantly, and the women are actually exceptionally strong. They're like 80th percentile. But you can see the key thing is that as the Aceh get older, they maintain their strength. Whereas in the West, people tend to lose their strength as they get older, especially some folks, because they're very inactive, and that's really one of the key things. And as I said before, the reason for that is that extra muscle is really costly, right? We have a use it or lose it phenomenon. So a typical sort of normal human being is about 30% muscle mass, which is, basically accounts for about 1 out of every 5 breaths you take. It's about 20% of your metabolism. But if you have like 40% muscle mass, like this bulked up Hollywood actor, right? You need another 200 to 300 calories a day to pay for that. And that's not something our ancestors had or needed. So we have this use it or lose it phenomenon, right? Originally it was an adaptation to use it or lose it. And now it's a mismatch. And that's one of the reasons why as we get older, it's really important to be physically active. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a real inspiration in that regard. She lived to be 87, partly because she went to the gym regularly and kind of kept up her physical activity. So let's stop being exercised about strength. Moderate strength is normal, but it's important to keep it up as you age. And by the way, I go into this in the book, but you don't need to just kind of do this whole no pain, no gain thing. If you want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, yes. But if you just want to have normal, sort of well-functioning strength, you don't need to do that. But again, a lot more about that is in the book. Okay, so another myth is that you can't lose weight walking, right? And I think this is an important myth because walking is by far the most fundamental form of physical activity. We know from data on hunter-gatherers in different parts of the world that women walk about 5 to 6 miles a day on average in different sort of populations, men around 9 miles a day. So to put that into perspective, hunter-gatherers are basically walking from LA to New York City every year. That's a sort of a normal amount of walking. And yet recently, we hear it a lot, right? Don't bother to exercise for weight loss. That basically exercising is kind of useless for weight loss and people should stop doing it. And like all of these sorts of things, there's some truth to these statements, right? If you want to lose weight, there's no question that dieting is far more effective, right? If you walk a mile, you spend about 50 calories, which is way less than the French fries you might eat afterwards because you're hungry. So we also engage in metabolic compensation. So if you exercise, you tend to be hungry. And there's some recent arguments that if you exercise, you can actually lower your basal metabolic rate. But the idea that 150 minute that exercise doesn't lead to weight loss is primarily based on studies that again look at that classic 150 minutes that I mentioned earlier. That's the minimum recommended amount that most the World Health Organization and other sort of health organizations recommend. And it's true. 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise, right, is just 21 minutes a day. And it turns out if you do that, the prediction is you'd lose about 0.5 pound a month, which could be about 6 pounds a year. And since the average American is trying to lose about 50 pounds, that's sort of a drop in the bucket, right? But if you go on a serious diet and you restrict your calories, you can lose a lot more weight a lot more rapidly. But remember, 150 minutes a week is pathetically small compared to what our ancestors did, right? So even if you just double it to 300 minutes a week, which is still much less than what your typical hunter-gatherer does, turns out, and there are experiments, including this one I've just cited here at the bottom, which actually do this, right? We actually got people to walk 300 minutes a week, and they lose about 1 pound a month, or about 12 pounds a year. So more evolutionary normal doses do actually lead to weight loss. And anyone who says that you can't lose exercise weight by exercising is bypassing some important literature. And even more importantly, exercise does help prevent weight gain and weight regain. There are many studies on this. This is one that was done right here in Boston, so I'm going to mention it because for parochial reasons. But in this study, they got a bunch of policemen and they who were overweight, and some of them went on a serious crash diet, and some of them went on a diet but also exercised. And the ones, of course, exercised lost a little bit more weight than the ones who dieted, but not a lot. But here's the key thing: the ones who after the diet was over, the non-exercisers pretty much regained almost all their weight. But the ones who continued to exercise, even though they were no longer dieting, managed to keep the weight off. And that's actually for almost a year after the diet. So let's stop being exercised about walking. It's the most fundamental and basic form of physical activity. It's an important component of every weight loss program. And you know, it's not the best way to lose weight really fast, but it's useful. Okay, so the final myth I want to mention is that it's normal to be less active as we age, right? We have this idea of retirement, right? When you get older, you can put your feet up, move to Florida or wherever it is that you want to go. And indeed, in the United States, as people get older, they become much less physically active. So these are data from really large data sets of many thousands of Americans. And you can see that the average 20 to 29-year-old is engaging in about 24 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activities. That means their heart rate's getting up to like 50% or more. So it's like a brisk walk or more. And people in their 60s are engaging in only about 12 minutes a day, right? So we are definitely becoming less active as we get older. And yet, I call this the active grandparent hypothesis. But you know, in the Paleolithic, there was no retirement, right? In fact, it turns out these are data from Kristen Hawkes show that how much time mothers and grandmothers and kids are spending foraging. That mothers spend about 2 to 5 hours a day foraging, but grandmothers, right, grandparents, are actually spending more time than their children. And what they're doing is they're actually generating a surplus, and they're providing that surplus of food to their children and their grandchildren, which help them. And that really helps them actually stay active and stay older. Being active helps them age because it turns out that the stresses of physical activity are really important for maintaining good health, right? So when you're physically active, your body produces all kinds of reactive oxygen species. So your body produces antioxidants. And in fact, you produce more antioxidants than you produce oxygen species that cause sort of rusting and sort of damage to your tissues, like mutations. You produce anti-inflammatories to counter the inflammation that's caused by exercise. You damage cells, so we produce all kinds of enzymes that repair our cells and repair our DNA and grow our muscles and brains and liver and bone. And pretty much every organ in the body is affected by physical activity. And in addition, physical activity helps us decrease the deposits of belly fat, visceral fat, which is very pro-inflammatory and causes a lot of diseases, helps lower blood sugar and blood fats and cholesterols and all kinds of things that can cause problems. So basically, physical activity is really important to keep us healthy and help us live longer. And that's, I think, the key, which is that we didn't evolve to become less active as we get older, but we evolved to stay active. And the older we get, the more we benefit from physical activity. And there's many studies which show this. But again, I'm going to be a little bit parochial and show you data that was done here at Harvard by Ralph Paffenbarger, who was one of the great epidemiologists of the last century. And Paffenbarger was a very clever guy, and he realized that that universities like Harvard keep track of their alumni. So he got and that it's actually kind of a nice sort of a demographic because you could control for socioeconomic status, etc. So he got the Harvard Alumni Association to let him track a whole bunch of alumni and ask them about their physical activity and find out when they died and what they died of. And what he showed was that, in this graph, this is just a lot of research summarized in one simple graph here. But if you look at alums who are in their 20s to up to 50, this is their death rate, their all-cause death rate. Note, by the way, it does not go down to zero because, of course, everybody has to die, right? But and on the x-axis here, he's graphing physical activity in terms of kilocalories a week. And so individuals who are exercising 2,000 calories a week, which is not a huge amount of exercise, it's moderate, but it's not huge, right? Their death rate was 21% lower than the alums who were physically inactive. Those in their 50s, the same amount of physical activity resulted in a 36% lower death rate. By the time they're in their 70s and 80s, the same amount of physical activity results in a 50% lower death rate. And now you know why, right? Because that physical activity turns on repair and maintenance mechanisms, which are crucial to helping us age in a healthy way. And the important thing to recognize is that you don't need to do crazy amounts of physical activity, right? You don't need to run marathons, right? Anything is beneficial. So this is a really famous study of more than 1 million Americans. This is a large data set, right? This is the relative risk of death against minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So like a brisk walk or more. And you notice that like just 60 minutes a week can lower your relative risk of death by about 40%. And 150 minutes a week, so again, 21 minutes a day, by about 50%, which is where that classic 150 minutes a week recommendation comes. But notice that as you keep doing more, you get more benefits, but eventually it tails off, right? So you don't need to do like marathons to get some benefit, but importantly, just even a little bit of physical activity, just a few minutes a day can still have substantial health benefits. So all in all, I hope, of course, there's a lot more in the book. I mean, I'm just giving you a kind of a tiny snippet of some of the myths and the ideas and the topics I cover. But again, my major goal is to try to get us away from this kind of heavily commercialized, heavily medicalized approach to physical activity and to exercise, and instead to adopt a kind of evolutionary and anthropological approach, right? Again, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I would say that includes exercise, and nothing about behavior, including exercise, makes sense except in the light of evolution, anthropology. And so I hope the book entertains and informs and enlightens, but I also hope it changes the way we think about exercise in particular and the science of health in general. I think, again, we've oversimplified people and confused them. It's overly biased by Westerners and elite athletes, and by a focus on weight loss. It's overly commercialized, it's overly medicalized, and I think it's very judgmental and very uncompassionate. And then finally, I hope the book is useful. The last section of the book, I talk about how to make exercise fun and necessary, and I talk about how and why it can be healthy and rewarding. But most fervently, I hope that it helps people enjoy being active, and it helps us be less exercised about exercise. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to answering some questions.
I found it interesting, Daniel, that your mother was a runner back in the day in 1969. And I think that was about 2 years after Catherine Switzer was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. Right. And why did she run so much? I mean, she ran more than the average person. Yeah.
Well, when she first started running, she could barely run a quarter of a mile, right? She actually couldn't run a quarter. I mean, she was completely bushed, right? And it took her a while to be able to run a half mile, and then a 3/4 of a mile, then a full mile. And she wasn't running because she was, it was really before the running boom. Of course, Kathy Switzer helped inspire a lot of people, including my mother. But she was running because she was a feminist. She was trying to liberate the gym. But the running became important to her. It changed her body, and she became she loved the effect it had on her, and she got my father to start running, and
really?
So they ran together for years and years and years, and it really, I think, helped both of them. And I started running too as a kid because I thought that's what people did, right? You do what your parents do. So I thought it was sort of normal. I never was on a team. I didn't race. I just thought it was, I would just run because I'm sure I was hyperactive as a kid. So she never raced. She never ran more than 5 miles a day. She was just a very committed jogger, and that was it. And she loved it.
Interesting. So a follower wanted to know, thank you for this wonderful talk. And they wanted to know how long it took you to write this book. And she wanted to talk about the whole process, because it looks like you did a lot of traveling, interviews, and research. I mean, so if you can talk about the whole process.
It probably took me about, well, I have a day job as a professor, so I'm teaching,
Yeah.
and we're also writing papers. I would say it took me about 2.5 years to write the book total, sort of, because I wasn't writing it all the time. I was writing a little bit, then I would go do other stuff and come back to it. And so it was never all at once. But I wrote a substantial portion of it when I was on sabbatical 1 year. And actually wrote the last sort of, the whole last sort of section of the book in Madrid when I was on sabbatical. But where it was a great place to run, by the way. Oh my God, hilly. But the process of writing, I'm a very methodical. I love writing. For me, I like to get up early in the morning when it's still quiet. Walk the dog, make coffee for my wife and myself, and then just kind of spend a few quiet hours writing, then go for a run, and then go into the lab. So that's kind of how I do it. It's for me, writing is thinking, and I love the process of thinking through things and learning things and checking ideas. But the traveling, I had this idea to write this book, I would say in 2012. And my job is to travel around the world and study. I study the evolution of physical activity. And when I sort of first got this idea to write the book, I thought, well, I really mustn't give up any opportunities I have to have experiences that might help with the book. So, I had some chances to go hunting with some Inuit in Greenland, and chances to go spend time with the Hadza, et cetera. And I leapt to do all of them. Some of the things I did because I thought it'd be interesting. Like, I describe in the book going to a mixed martial arts fight. And or that I did a race where I ran a marathon against horses. Right? So that was so I kind of went out of my way to have some experiences, because I wanted to put myself in I wanted to try. I'm very interested in participant observation. I like trying things out.
Kind of like a George Plimpton type of.
Yeah, maybe a little bit more academic, but yeah.
I would think so. Yeah, definitely.
But absolutely. But I think, I think it's important to put yourself in other people's shoes, or barefoot, as maybe the case may be. Yeah.
So I got to ask though, what was the experience running a marathon with horses like?
Well, I describe it actually in the book. It was really quite. It was hilarious. It's kind of a little mom and pop race in Arizona. It's called Man Against Horse in Prescott, Arizona, and it's not very big, which is nice. And there were, I think the year I ran it, there were 41 runners and 53 horses, and it was very dispiriting at first, because the horses all pass you very quickly. They're horses after all, right? And I'm just a little human, and I'm not, a great runner. I'm an okay runner. I like to run, but I'm not super fast. And but the amazing thing is that as it gets hotter, and of course it's over a mountain, right? And so the hotter it gets, the better the humans are, and the horses overheat, and so they have to stop. And so I started passing horses around mile 18 of the race, and I have to tell you, that was one of the best runner's high I've ever had in my life, as I started passing horses. So I ended up actually beating almost all the horses in that race, even though I didn't run a particularly fast time. So that was super exciting, a lot of fun.
Horses can get pretty competitive too, especially racing horses.
Yeah. So and there's a special kind of
like it.
Yeah, there's a special kind of horse racing called endurance horse racing, and these horses are trained just like humans train, and their riders are very competitive. It's a big deal.
Cool. I encourage others to chime in here with your questions. I have one from T. wondering how much exercise is too much, and when does it become detrimental to one's overall health
So
to
that's a
be exercising too much?
yeah, that's a very common question, and you know there are a lot of
Mhm.
people who worry about that. First of all, the first thing is that there's almost nobody really is out there, right? So I'm not really worried about people exercising too much. I'm much more worried about people who don't exercise enough. So it's not really a major concern. but
Mhm.
but that said, you know, if you ask most doctors will say, yeah, you know, maybe you can do it, overdo it, and there's sort of worries about it. The interesting thing is if you look for data on the topic, there's really actually no evidence for that. And that's partly
Mhm.
because there's just not a lot of people out there at those extreme ends. But for example, there was in that graph I showed earlier, you'll see that at that graph, there's some people out there doing like 30 hours of exercise a week, but they're not actually significantly more have higher relative rates of mortality than people doing sort of 15 hours a week or 10 hours a week. And actually a study just came out from the UK Biobank study, which is an enormous study. And there they actually had really good data from a lot of people. And again, they found no
Mhm.
evidence that the people who are at the really extreme end are have higher rates of mortality. So is it possible? Yes. But is there actually very good evidence for it? No. But you know, it's not really an issue for most people. And the other thing is that at those levels of exercise, you're not doing yourself a favor either, right? There's no extra benefit to doing extreme
Mhm.
exercise. People do it for reasons other than
Mhm.
the health effect.
Yeah, I can attest. I think I have some friends who do those 100-mile runs, like the Western States 100, and it's even from somebody with an endurance background that I've had, that seems a bit extreme. And I always thought that was a little bit too much
Oh my
to
God. I
do.
mean, look, look, humans never evolved to stand on one line and run even 26.2 miles to another line. The fact that we do
Mhm.
it, we can do it, but that's a very weird thing, especially at the speeds that elite athletes do it. They run at ridiculous speeds that no Paleolithic hunter-gatherer ever runs at. But running 100 miles is like a completely modern thing. This is not, I'm sure our ancestors who are energy limited did not do that on a rate, it just doesn't make much sense. The, the,
Mhm.
the, 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 the peoples who do it, like the Tarahumara and other Native Americans, when they do these long races,
Mhm.
remember those long distance races. That's spiritual. That's a form of prayer. They're not doing that
Mhm.
for health and fitness. They're doing it for very beautiful sort of spiritual reasons. But it's not a and maybe that's why a lot of ultra marathoners do it too in their own way.
Mhm. That's how I like how you described the game with the ball and how the Tarahumara, the men would kick the ball down, and there's a lot of aspects of not only endurance but spirituality, but also play because they're kicking this ball and they're kind of reverting back to their childhood, it seems, by doing so.
Yeah, I mean, again, remember, physical activity, we evolved to do it for two reasons and two reasons only. It was necessary and rewarding.
Mhm.
And the Tarahumara, like every Native American peoples, have traditional races. Tarahumara just are still doing them, but for them, it's a form of prayer. It's a way of honoring their God, and it's also socially important. They bet tons of money and goats and
Mhm.
food and clothing and whatever, and it's important for prestige. I mean, it has all kinds of reasons that people do it, just like we do in our culture. That's so it's I think there's a lot of sort of myths about the Tarahumara that we need to dispel.
Okay. In addition, there different cultures have customs and games like that. Like I think it's Afghanistan has Buzkashi, the goat hockey game where
Oh
they
yeah,
would
it's like
throw it around the,
it's like polo. Yeah.
yeah, with a dead goat or something like that.
Well, every culture in the world has forms of sports and games, and there's a chapter in the book on sports and the evolution of sports and the role that sports play. And we think of sports today in the United States as forms of exercise, but sports did not evolve for exercise. They evolved for
Mhm.
all kinds of other reasons, train people to fight. And I think that sports evolved to teach children play to teach children good sportsmanship and not to be reactively aggressive. I go into quite a bit of detail in the book about that. And I think in the United States, we make a kind of false equivalence between sports and exercise. And I also think that we have an overemphasis on elite athletes and elite sports. And I think it's actually, it's fun and enjoyable to watch great, professional athletes, but I think it can also have a negative consequence too. And I think we need to be really more careful about that.
Mm. Along the lines of culture, I wanted to get your impression. You opened the book talking about going to the Ironman, try white. And I was just curious what your first impressions were of seeing all these people. I've done the Ironman in 25 years ago or so, but to an outsider, I'm sure it must have been something very different. It was a culture unto itself, I would think.
Yeah, so I've been twice now to Ironman, and I like running marathons, and I can see myself doing the bike ride, but the 2.4 mile open water swim, I will never do. I do not like to swim, and
that's the easiest part.
No, not for me. I'm basically a dog paddler. I mean, I'm just not a. That's just. It gives me palpitations even to think about that kind of swimming distance. But it's it's a very grueling, crazy event, and it's also I've noticed that. I hope I don't insult anybody, but my impression is that a lot of the people who do Ironman are pretty kind of obsessed type A people, right? A lot of them are very wealthy folks who made a lot of money, and then they went to see their doctor, and I'm stereotyping here. I apologize if I am, and their doctor
No,
said,
you're not.
You're about to die. You better take up some exercise, and they kind of give the same intensity to their sport as they did to making their first few $1 million. And they just take it to the extreme, and they're very obsessive, and which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not opposed to it. It's very extreme. It's not normal to do that kind of physical activity. And the motto is anything is possible, right? And it's very it's very emotional especially to watch the finishers come in at near midnight, right? The ones who are trying to get in under the 17-hour limit by midnight, and that watching those last folks come across the finish line is extraordinary to watch. But it's also you can't help but look at that and wonder why they're doing it, right? It's not you don't need to do that to be healthy, right? It's not about health and fitness. It's also extremely expensive. This is about there's something about that drives people to push themselves to the extreme to show that they can do it, and endure incredible pain and discomfort, and just think about the challenges for their marriages and all that other kind of stuff, right? This is not a normal thing, and I think part of that, the emphasis on that, is I think very off-putting. It's one of the reasons why people are so exercise, because we have this idea that real athletes do Ironman or do marathons or these 100-mile bike races or whatever. But anything is good, and I think you don't need to run super fast or I think again, Ironman is about as commercialized as you can get, right? It's totally commercialized. And I think I'm not opposed to that, but I think that we've overly commercialized exercise, and I think there's a sort of a dark side to some of that.
I agree. I think that when the median income of your participants are about $150,000 a year, kind of tells you something. A little bit about the sport.
Yeah. You can't. I mean, and that's the other thing that's sort of sad about physical exercise today, which is that, and I think the pandemic is, like so many things in this pandemic, has revealed various disparities. And one of the disparities is who can exercise, right? People who have gyms or have leisure time, and they're not commuting, and they can afford trainers and et cetera. I mean, and during this pandemic, we've seen increased divergence in exercise. So the people who have been actually exercising more, and the people who don't and are stressed and struggling have been exercising less. And of course, it's another sort of one of the casualties of this pandemic.
It's interesting you mentioned economics because my coworker was saying, we were talking about your book earlier today, and she was saying that people pay people to clean their houses, to cook, or to do things for them. Then they also, which are physical activities that could benefit us if we did them ourselves. But they also pay a physical trainer good money to put them through the ringer to have them exercise.
Yep.
So there's this whole industry. It's really interesting.
Right. But that's absolutely true. But in general, we're in a very strange inversion, right? Because it used to be that only the super wealthy could afford to be physically inactive. And now, because of commuting and jobs and whatever, it's really only the super wealthy who actually now can afford to be physically active. Just like it used to be, only the super wealthy can afford to eat unhealthy food. Now it's only the super wealthy who can afford to eat healthy food. We've created this completely inverted world, and not just in terms of diet, but also physical activity. And of course, we all pay for it.
Indeed. Well, Daniel Lieberman, thank you for taking the time to speak with us at Chaucer's. Everyone, exercise. Why something we never evolved to do is healthy and rewarding. Please buy the book. It's a wonderful book. And I hope everyone has a nice evening. And thank you, Daniel.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good night.
All right. Good night.